Please, do not let me fall asleep. The voice was so faint Grace Miller almost mistook it for the wind. She stopped beneath the snow-heavy pines, her breath turning white in the darkness. The trail back to Pine Ridge had nearly disappeared beneath 6 inches of fresh snow, and every sensible instinct told her to keep moving. Then she heard it again. Please. Grace turned toward the forest. Nobody would have blamed the weakest Omega in Pine Ridge for staying on the road. They barely trusted her to carry supplies beyond the settlement, much less search the woods during the worst storm of the winter. But somewhere beyond those trees, a child was alone. Grace stepped off the trail. Snow reached above her boots as she pushed between the pines, following a sound that vanished whenever the wind rose. Keep talking to me, she called. I am coming. No answer. Her heartbeat quickened. She moved another 20 yards, then saw something small beside a fallen pine. A little boy sat curled beneath its branches, his dark coat dusted white. He could not have been older than 4. Grace dropped beside him. Hey, look at me. His eyes opened slowly. Gray. Frightened. Exhausted. That is it, she whispered. Stay with me. She removed her cloak and wrapped it around his shoulders. The cold immediately reached through her sweater, but she ignored it. What is your name? Oliver. Okay, Oliver. I am Grace. Do you know where your family is? His lips trembled. Daddy was there. Then I could not feel him. Grace did not understand what that meant, but the fear in his face needed no explanation. We will find him. She looked toward Pine Ridge. The settlement was more than a mile away, and the storm was worsening. The old ranger cabin was less than half that distance. Shelter first. Questions later. Grace lifted Oliver carefully into her arms. He was heavier than she expected, and each step through the deepening snow demanded more strength than the last. She had spent years hearing that weakness was the first thing anyone noticed about her. Tonight, she refused to let that word decide what she could carry. Oliver pressed his face against her shoulder. You are warm, he murmured. Grace almost laughed. She was freezing. Then borrow some. A gust swept through the trees. She turned her body to shield him, and something silver flashed near his collar. Grace stopped. A metal clasp had slipped free from beneath his coat. She brushed away the snow with one gloved thumb. Her breath caught. Engraved into the silver was a wolf wearing a crown. Grace had seen that crest only twice before, always hanging above official proclamations from the royal territory. Every pack knew what it meant. Every Omega knew whose family carried it. She looked down at the child in her arms. Oliver's eyes were already closing again. Grace tightened the cloak around him and started toward the ranger cabin faster. Whatever had happened in these woods, she was no longer carrying home a lost child. She was carrying the Alpha King's son. Grace had gone less than a quarter mile when voices broke through the storm behind her. Grace Miller. She stopped and turned, keeping Oliver tucked beneath her cloak as 3 lanterns moved between the trees. Thomas Bennett reached her first, snow clinging to his patrol jacket. Victoria Hale followed several steps behind him, her expression tightening the moment she saw the child in Grace's arms. Where did you get him? Victoria demanded. Grace felt Oliver stir against her shoulder. I found him near a fallen pine. He was alone. Thomas lifted his lantern, and his eyes settled on the silver clasp at Oliver's collar. His face changed instantly. That is the royal crest. Victoria stepped closer. Give him to us. We are taking him back to Pine Ridge. Grace looked toward the distant settlement. More than a mile of exposed trail separated them from the nearest heated building there. The ranger cabin was less than half a mile ahead, sheltered by dense pines. Wind pushed another curtain of snow across the path. No. The word left Grace quietly. Victoria stared at her. Grace had spent years lowering her eyes when higher-ranked wolves spoke. She had learned how easily one word from someone important could become a punishment for someone like her. But Oliver's fingers had tightened around her sweater. That mattered more. What did you say? Victoria asked. Grace raised her eyes. He needs warmth now. The ranger cabin is closer. You are refusing a direct order? I am refusing to carry a freezing 4-year-old more than a mile through this storm, when shelter is less than half a mile away. Thomas glanced at the trees, then at Oliver. She is right. Victoria turned sharply toward him. Thomas, the temperature is dropping. We use the cabin. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Oliver whispered something against Grace's shoulder. She bent closer. What was that? His eyelids fluttered. Do not leave me. Grace's chest tightened. I will not. She started forward. This time Thomas walked beside her. Victoria followed because there was no sensible argument left. The cabin appeared through the snow several minutes later, a dark shape beneath towering pines. Thomas opened the door and hurried to light the old iron stove while Grace carried Oliver inside. The room smelled of cedar, dust, and cold stone. She lowered him onto a narrow cot, kept her cloak around him, and rubbed warmth back into his small hands. Victoria remained near the door. How exactly did you find him? Grace did not look up. I heard him. In this storm? Yes. Victoria's silence felt heavier than accusation. Thomas placed another piece of wood into the stove. Orange light slowly filled the cabin. Oliver opened his eyes. For the first time, he seemed fully awake. He looked at Grace as though trying to understand something. Oliver, she said gently, how did you get so far into the woods? The boy swallowed. I followed her. Grace froze. Victoria stepped away from the wall. Followed who? Oliver looked toward the dark window, where snow swept past the glass. His voice became barely more than a whisper. The lady calling me. Grace exchanged a glance with Thomas. What lady? Oliver slowly lifted one hand and pointed directly at Grace. Her voice. I heard her before she found me. Grace did not answer at first. The old ranger cabin seemed to shrink around Oliver's words, leaving only the soft crackle of the stove and the wind pressing against the windows. You heard my voice? She finally asked. Oliver nodded. Before you came. Victoria gave a short, disbelieving breath. He is 4 years old, exhausted and frightened. He probably heard someone from the search party. There was no search party near where I found him, Grace said. Victoria folded her arms. And now the weakest Omega in Pine Ridge expects us to believe she somehow called the Alpha King's son through a blizzard? The familiar label landed exactly where it always did. Weakest. Grace had heard it since she was 16, when every other Omega her age learned to complete a shift, and she could not. She had stopped defending herself years ago. Tonight felt different. I do not expect you to believe anything, Grace said. I only care that Oliver is safe. Thomas looked toward the boy. Oliver, what did the voice say? The child frowned, searching his memory. It did not say words. Victoria almost smiled. There, you see. But Oliver shook his head. It felt warm. His small hand emerged from beneath Grace's cloak. He reached toward her. Grace hesitated before allowing his fingers to close around hers. The instant they touched, Oliver's expression softened. Like that. Grace stared at their joined hands. Nothing looked different. No light. No mark. Yet something inside her chest shifted, almost too faint to notice, like a distant vibration traveling through the floor. Guardian, Oliver whispered. Grace looked at him. What did you call me? Guardian. Victoria laughed once, but there was no humor in it. That is enough. Thomas did not join her. Where did he learn that word? Royal children learn hundreds of old titles, Victoria replied. It means nothing. Grace wanted to agree. Guardian belonged in old stories, not in a cold cabin with a woman who could barely shift. Then Oliver suddenly sat upright. Daddy. His fingers tightened painfully around hers. What is wrong? Grace asked. His breathing quickened. I cannot feel him. Thomas moved closer. Feel who? My daddy. Oliver pressed his free hand against his chest. He is gone. Your father is not gone, Grace said quickly. He is looking for you. No. Tears filled Oliver's eyes. I always feel him. Here. Grace understood then. A family. Bond. Strong wolves sometimes described it as a presence that remained at the edge of awareness, especially between parents and young children. Oliver could no longer sense his father. Victoria's confidence vanished. That should not happen. Grace barely heard her. Beneath Oliver's frightened breathing, beneath the stove and storm, another rhythm had entered her awareness. Slow, powerful, distant, a heartbeat that did not belong to anyone inside the cabin. Grace held perfectly still. It came again. Once. Twice. Her own pulse began matching it. Oliver looked directly into her eyes. You hear him too. Grace's breath caught. 30 seconds earlier, she would have said that was impossible. Now she could not. Somewhere beyond the snow and mountains, another heart was beating, and somehow Grace could hear it. The heartbeat came again, slow and steady beneath the noise of the storm, and Grace knew with impossible certainty that it belonged to Oliver's father. She closed her eyes, afraid that moving might break whatever fragile connection had formed. Grace, Thomas asked quietly. She lifted one hand. Wait. Oliver still held her fingers. His breathing was uneven, his frightened eyes fixed on her face. Grace moved closer to the cot. Oliver, listen to me. I want you to think about your father. I cannot feel him. Then remember him. Remember his voice. Remember what it feels like when you know you are safe with him. Oliver swallowed and closed his eyes. Grace expected nothing. She was the Omega who could not complete a shift, the woman Pine Ridge trusted with firewood and errands because nobody imagined she could do anything important. Yet the distant heartbeat grew clearer. Then warmth moved through her palm. Grace opened her eyes. A thin silver glow had appeared between her fingers and Oliver's. Thomas stepped forward. Victoria went completely silent. The light was not bright enough to fill the cabin. It was delicate, almost like moonlight caught beneath clear water. A narrow silver thread rose from Oliver's hand, crossed Grace's wrist, and seemed to continue beyond the cabin wall. Grace stared at it. She could somehow sense its direction. Beyond the forest. Beyond Pine Ridge. Miles away. What is that? Thomas whispered. I do not know. The instant Grace spoke, the cabin disappeared from her awareness. For one breath, she stood somewhere else. A large room. Tall windows. Maps spread across a long wooden table. Men and women in dark coats moved urgently around it. And at the center stood a man Grace had never seen before. Tall, dark-haired, still in a way that made everyone around him seem hurried. His silver eyes were fixed on a map, but grief and concentration had hardened every line of his face. Grace knew him before anyone said his name. Ethan Blackwood, the Alpha King, Oliver's father. Then Ethan suddenly raised his head. His eyes found hers. Grace forgot how to breathe. There were 30 miles of winter wilderness between them, perhaps more, yet he was looking directly at her. Not through her. At her. His expression changed from exhaustion to disbelief. Oliver. His voice reached her as though spoken from across the room. Grace tightened her hand around the child's fingers. He is safe. Ethan took one step toward her. Where? The vision trembled. Grace tried to answer, but the silver thread flickered. Oliver whispered, Daddy. Ethan's face softened instantly. Oliver. The boy smiled through his tears. I can feel him again. Grace felt the connection beginning to fade. She forced out the only words that mattered. Pine Ridge. Old Ranger Cabin. Ethan heard her. She knew because his entire expression changed. Relief came first. Then something else. Something startled and deeply confused as his attention shifted from Oliver back to Grace. His hand moved slowly toward his own wrist. Grace felt sudden warmth around hers at exactly the same place. The silver light vanished. The cabin returned. Grace opened her eyes to Thomas and Victoria staring at her. Oliver was smiling now. But 30 miles away, Ethan Blackwood remained motionless beside the map table, staring at the empty space where Grace had been. His fingers closed around his warming wrist. Who are you? 30 miles away, Ethan Blackwood was still staring at his wrist when the connection vanished. For hours, the bond with his son had been nothing. But silence, an absence so complete that every map, every search route, every report had begun to feel useless. Now Oliver was there again. Faint, but unmistakable. Alive. Safe. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second and let that truth settle before opening them again. Redirect every vehicle to Pine Ridge, he ordered. The command room moved instantly. Maps were folded, radios lifted, routes changed. The old Ranger cabin is outside the eastern boundary. We take the service road through Blackstone Pass. An older man near the table, Royal Elder Samuel Whitmore, studied Ethan carefully. How do you know where he is? Ethan looked toward the place where the impossible vision had appeared. Someone showed me. Samuel's expression sharpened. Through Oliver's bond. I do not know. That answer bothered Ethan more than he allowed anyone to see. He had known supernatural bonds his entire life. He knew the presence of family, pack, loyalty, grief. What had just happened belonged to none of them. A young woman had appeared across 30 miles of winter wilderness as clearly as if she stood before him. Brown hair damp with snow. A pale, exhausted face. Frightened eyes that had still managed to remain calm for Oliver. She had not asked for recognition. She had not even introduced herself. Her first words to him had been about his son. He is safe. Ethan reached for his coat. Heat moved beneath the skin of his wrist again. He stopped. Your Majesty? Samuel asked. Nothing. Ethan pulled his sleeve lower and walked toward the waiting vehicles. Outside, snow swept across the mountain road beneath powerful headlights. The convoy began moving within minutes. Ethan sat in the first vehicle, watching darkness pass beyond the window while Oliver's restored presence remained at the edge of his awareness. Every few moments, another sensation accompanied it. Warmth. Not Oliver's. Hers. He could not explain why he knew the difference. Samuel sat across from him in silence until Ethan finally pushed his sleeve back. A faint silver curve rested beneath the skin of his wrist. Samuel leaned forward. How long has that been there? Since the connection returned. The elder's face lost color. Does it hurt? No. Burn. Warm. Samuel stared at the mark for several seconds. Have you seen the woman before tonight? Never. Ethan covered his wrist again. Whatever this is can wait. My son cannot. The convoy continued through Blackstone Pass. Back at the ranger cabin, Grace sat beside Oliver while Thomas checked the storm through the window. Victoria had stopped questioning her. That silence somehow felt stranger than criticism. Oliver leaned against Grace's shoulder. He is coming, he said. Grace looked down. Your father? Oliver nodded with absolute certainty. Then his gaze dropped to her wrist. Grace followed it. Beneath her skin, where Ethan's hand had touched his own wrist in the vision, a thin silver crescent appeared for one heartbeat and disappeared. Oliver smiled. He felt you too. Far down the mountain road. Ethan looked toward the first distant lights of Pine Ridge. Beneath his sleeve, the silver curve brightened. The first royal vehicle reached Pine Ridge just before midnight, its headlights cutting through the falling snow like two pale beams across the dark settlement. Grace had returned from the ranger cabin with Oliver only minutes earlier, escorted by Thomas and Victoria after the storm weakened enough for safe travel. Word had spread quickly. By the time the convoy stopped near the main lodge, half the settlement seemed to be watching from porches and doorways. Grace barely noticed them. Oliver's hand was wrapped around hers. Then the rear door of the first vehicle opened. Ethan Blackwood stepped into the snow. Grace recognized him immediately. The same dark hair, the same silver eyes, the same face she had seen 30 miles away through a connection she still could not explain. Yet there was nothing distant about him now. His gaze found Oliver, and for one suspended moment, the Alpha King disappeared behind the expression of a frightened father finally seeing his child. Daddy! Oliver released Grace's hand and ran toward him. Ethan dropped to one knee and opened his arms. Oliver reached him, and Ethan held his son close, closing his eyes as if he needed the physical weight of the boy to convince himself this was real. Grace looked away, suddenly feeling like an intruder inside something deeply private. I knew you would come, Oliver said. Ethan touched his son's cheek. I will always come for you. A royal physician approached and quietly checked Oliver while Ethan remained beside him. Only after being assured that the boy was warm, alert, and safe did Ethan finally stand. His eyes moved across the gathered crowd. Who found my son? Marcus Reed, the Pine Ridge pack leader, stepped forward. Your Majesty, our patrol located him with one of our Omegas. Grace felt something tighten inside her. Located him with. For words, and somehow the truth had already become smaller. Before she could speak, Oliver slipped away from the physician. He crossed the snowy courtyard and returned directly to Grace. His small fingers closed around hers. She found me. Silence spread through the crowd. Oliver looked up at Ethan. She heard me when nobody else did. Ethan's attention settled on Grace. Recognition passed between them immediately. Grace could see the exact moment he understood. You, he said softly. She nodded. Grace Miller. Ethan crossed the space between them but stopped several feet away, careful not to crowd her. You were in the cabin. Yes. And you restored my connection to Oliver. Grace shook her head. I do not know what I did. Neither do I. His answer surprised her. Kings were supposed to have answers. Ethan looked at her as though honesty mattered more than appearing certain. Oliver squeezed Grace's hand. She kept me warm. Ethan's expression softened. Then I owe you more than I can say. Grace lowered her gaze instinctively, but caught herself and looked back at him. You do not owe me anything. He needed help. Something changed in Ethan's face. Not surprise exactly. Something quieter. Then warmth suddenly spread across Grace's wrist. She inhaled. Ethan's eyes dropped toward his own hand at the same moment. Beneath his sleeve, silver light appeared. Grace's wrist answered with a faint glow of its own. Behind Ethan, Elder Samuel Whitmore stepped out of the royal vehicle and stopped completely. His eyes widened as he stared at Grace. "Your Majesty," he whispered. "Do not touch her yet." Ethan turned. "Why?" Samuel looked from Ethan's wrist to Grace's. "Because I think I know what she is." Samuel's warning settled over the courtyard, but before he could explain, Victoria stepped forward. "Your Majesty, there is something you should know." Grace felt Oliver's fingers tighten around hers. Ethan turned toward Victoria without moving closer to Grace. "Speak." Victoria hesitated beneath the attention of the entire settlement. Grace was alone with the prince when we found them. She claims she heard him through the storm, but nobody knows how he reached that part of the forest. Murmurs moved through the crowd. Grace knew those sounds. She had lived beneath them for years. Doubt always arrived before anyone bothered asking her what happened. Ethan's expression remained controlled. "Are you accusing her of something?" "I am saying we should not ignore unusual circumstances simply because the prince returned safely." Grace expected the old instinct to take over. "Lower your eyes. Stay quiet. Let someone stronger answer." Instead, she looked directly at Victoria. "You found me carrying him toward shelter." Her voice was calm. "You wanted to take him more than a mile through the storm. I refused because the ranger cabin was closer." Thomas stepped forward immediately. "That is true." Victoria looked at him. "Thomas, I was there." Grace kept the boy warm. "She chose the cabin because it was safer. I also witnessed the silver light." The murmuring stopped. Ethan looked toward Marcus. "Tell me about Grace Miller." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "She is an Omega of Pine Ridge." "That was not my question." Marcus glanced at Grace. "She has always been considered our weakest Omega." Grace felt the words settle over her again, but this time they sounded strangely distant. Ethan's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" "She never completed a full shift." Marcus paused. "Her abilities never developed like the others." Ethan looked back at Grace, then at Oliver holding her hand. "And because of that, you decided she had no strength worth recognizing?" Nobody answered. Snow drifted softly through the lantern light. Ethan's voice remained quiet. "My son was alone in a winter storm. The person you call weakest heard him, found him, gave him her own cloak, chose shelter over status, and somehow restored a bond that even I could not reach." His gaze moved across the gathered pack. "Perhaps you have been measuring strength incorrectly." Grace forgot the cold. For years, she had imagined defending herself with perfect words. She had never imagined that when the moment came, she would not need anger. The truth was enough. Victoria lowered her eyes. Marcus looked ashamed. Grace didn't either. She simply stood beside Oliver. Samuel approached slowly, studying her wrist. "Grace, may I see your hand?" She hesitated, then raised it. A silver shape appeared beneath her skin, clearer than before. Not the crescent she had briefly seen earlier, but an intricate symbol resembling a star enclosed by delicate branching lines. Samuel inhaled sharply. "I have seen this mark only in the royal archives." Ethan stepped closer but stopped before reaching her. "What does it mean?" Samuel looked at Grace with something that was not fear, pity, or disbelief. It was recognition. Guardian bloodline. Grace stared at him. "That is impossible." "No," Samuel said softly. "Rare, but not impossible." Oliver smiled as though he had known all along. Then Ethan's wrist began glowing again. This time the silver crescent did not fade. Samuel turned toward him, and whatever relief had entered his expression disappeared beneath astonishment. "There are two marks," he whispered, "and they do not mean the same thing." Samuel stared at Ethan's wrist for several seconds before speaking. "The mark on Grace identifies what she is. The mark on you identifies something else." Grace could hear the snow settling around the courtyard, soft against stone and rooftops. Everyone seemed to be waiting for the elder's next breath. Ethan kept his attention on Samuel. "Explain." Samuel turned gently toward Grace. Guardian bloodlines were once known for sensing bonds between wolves, especially bonds under strain. They could strengthen what already existed, sometimes across extraordinary distances. Grace looked at Oliver. "That is why I could hear him." "Most likely. And why you could reach his father through him." She stared at the silver symbol beneath her skin. All her life, Pine Ridge had measured her by the one thing she could not do. Nobody had ever wondered whether something else was waiting inside her. "Then his mark appeared because I restored the bond?" Grace asked. Samuel shook his head. "No." Ethan's expression sharpened. You are certain? Guardian power can strengthen an existing bond. It cannot manufacture one that was never there. Samuel looked between them. These are two separate truths. Grace felt her heartbeat quicken. She already knew what the silence meant before Samuel said it. The crescent on the Alpha King's wrist is a mate mark. A quiet wave of shock passed through Pine Ridge. Grace remained perfectly still. Mate. The word felt too large for the space between one heartbeat and the next. Ethan looked down at the silver crescent, then back at her. There was surprise in his face, but no triumph. No claim. That mattered more than Grace expected. Samuel continued. Grace did not earn this mark by saving Oliver. She did not create it through guardian power. The connection existed independently. Her gift simply brought two paths close enough for it to reveal itself. Oliver looked delighted. I knew she was special. Grace almost smiled, but uncertainty held her in place. Ethan seemed to notice. He slowly extended one hand, stopping before reaching hers. May I? 2 words. A question, not an order. Grace looked at his open palm. The Alpha King could command an entire territory, yet he was waiting for permission from the woman Pine Ridge had barely considered worth hearing. She placed her hand in his. Warmth moved through her fingers, gentle and immediate. Silver light traced the guardian symbol on her wrist. Ethan's crescent brightened, and a small star appeared beside it, completing the mark. Grace inhaled softly. There was no overwhelming force, no voice telling her what she must do. Only recognition. A quiet certainty that Ethan was somehow familiar despite being almost a stranger. His silver eyes held hers. Do you feel that? He asked. Yes. He released her hand first. Grace noticed that too. Victoria stood silent. Marcus lowered his gaze. Samuel smiled faintly. The archives describe it clearly. A guardian may reveal what has been hidden, but she cannot create destiny. Ethan looked at Grace for a long moment. Then destiny can wait. Samuel blinked. Grace did too. Ethan's voice softened. You saved my son because he needed you, not because of a mark. I will not turn that kindness into an obligation. For the first time that night, Grace felt something stronger than wonder. Relief. Ethan stepped back, giving her space. Whatever this bond means, Grace Miller, you decide what happens next. By sunrise, the storm had passed, leaving Pine Ridge beneath a quiet blanket of white. Grace stood near the road with her repaired cloak around her shoulders, watching sunlight spread across the mountains. Everything looked familiar, yet nothing felt the same. For years, she had believed leaving Pine Ridge would require becoming stronger by someone else's definition. Now she understood she had never needed permission to have value. Footsteps approached behind her. Ethan stopped several feet away. Oliver walked beside him, holding his wooden wolf. Samuel says the royal archives contain records about guardian families, Ethan said. You may read every one of them. Grace turned toward him. And if I decide that is all I want, then that is all you will owe me. She searched his face for disappointment and found none. Ethan glanced at the completed mark on his wrist. This tells me something extraordinary happened between us. It does not tell me what you must do about it. Grace looked toward Pine Ridge. Marcus stood near the lodge with Thomas. Victoria remained farther back, unusually quiet. Grace felt no satisfaction in seeing their discomfort. She only felt free of the need to convince them. Oliver stepped closer. Are you coming with us? Grace crouched so they were eye level. Would you like me to? He nodded immediately. You hear people when everyone else stops listening. The words touched something deeper than praise. Grace stood again. Ethan extended his hand, then waited. He did not close the distance. He did not invoke destiny, rank, or the mark. He simply gave her a choice. Grace looked at his open hand and remembered another hand in a frozen cabin, much smaller and frightened, reaching for hers because it needed warmth. She had taken that hand without knowing it belonged to royalty, without knowing anyone would ever thank her. That was the person she wanted to remain. Not the weakest Omega, not the Alpha King's destined mate. Grace Miller. She stepped forward and placed her hand in Ethan's. The marks on their wrists gave one soft silver glow and settled. Oliver immediately took her other hand. Ethan smiled, and this time Grace smiled back. Together they started toward the waiting vehicles, 3 sets of footprints crossing the fresh snow. Behind Grace stood the place that had taught her to doubt herself. Ahead waited unanswered questions, royal archives, a strange new bond, and a future she would choose one day at a time. The morning sun broke through the clouds, turning the snow gold around them. Grace did not know where destiny would lead. She only knew she was walking toward it by choice. And sometimes that was where the truest kind of strength began. If Grace's journey reminded you that kindness can reveal strength the world overlooks, please like this video, share this story with someone who believes in second chances, and subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, destiny, and love.